Roderick, Brenden Schaeffer with you here on a Card Central 365, brought to you by DraftKings. The crown is yours here on STL Sports Central. And today, Brenden, I thought we would just kind of go a little deeper into the past week of Chaim Bloom talk and get to that next layer of what the front office looks like of the new look St. Louis Cardinals, and a name that people are going to, I think, be hearing a little more of. A name that we heard about a year ago when he was hired, and now it's going to start coming out more and more. And that's Rob Cerfolio, the assistant general manager for the Cardinals, also the head of player development and performance with the Cardinals. And just kind of a quick look into what this who this man is with the Cards.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's going to be a pretty big figure, honestly, in whatever we want to call it, the rebuild, the next kind of iteration of the St. Louis Cardinals. I think Rob Cerfolio's name is one that's going to be front and center, right? He's kind of been behind the scenes. Chaim Bloom himself has been behind the scenes in that final year of John Mozeliak's tenure, but now it's Chaim Bloom's show. And when you think back to about a year ago at this time and the press conference that announced that Chaim Bloom would be taking over for Mo right around now, then it was important that Chaim Bloom was authorized by ownership to start sort of forming his version of the front office and making hires and tweaking things and moving things around. And at that time, they hired Rob Cerfolio, a young guy that has been a rising star within baseball and was with the Cleveland Guardians organization, to head up the new look department of player development and performance, sort of taking those two things, having an overarching figure over the top of both of them, and then sort of splitting it off beneath Cerfolio's guidance as to, how they want to look at those two categories. And it was the farm director previously, Gary LaRocque, right? He had a very high-ranking role in the organization and sort of taking parts of what that role looked like, but then sort of shifting it and tweaking it to whatever it needs to look like under Chaim Bloom's guidance. Cerfolio was the very first hire, right, that Chaim Bloom made. And so to describe him now as sort of the number two in command, I think is accurate. There is no GM as we knew it under the Mozeliak era, right, when Mo was elevated to the POBO, the president of baseball operations. Mike Gersh was elevated in his title to the GM role. Right now, I don't believe there is one for the Cardinals, and Chaim Bloom, it sounds like, is going to hire one or name one at some point, but not necessarily in any rush to do so. And it may not happen this offseason. It may not happen before the 2026 season begins. So as of right now, certainly when you think about where the Cardinals are in terms of the process toward building this thing back up, somebody that's in charge of player development and performance and has been working with guys at both the major and minor league levels would be a very key figure, I think, in elevating the Cardinals from where they are now and trying to get the ball rolling on the next iteration of the organization.
And I think when you look at what was said last week in the press conferences and you look at what we have read about since then, it does it really magnifies the role that Cerfolio is going to play immediately with the Cardinals, because we know that they're not going out and they're going to be big spenders on the big league club next year. They're not going to go out and try to sign Kyle Tucker or Pete Alonso next season or any of these top free agent pitchers that are out there, Framber Valdez, somebody like that. We do know that they are going to be investing, like we talked about yesterday, a lot of money in the scouting, a lot of money in the player development in the minor leagues to make sure that any players that they're acquiring or have acquired have the tools necessary to be ready to go at the big league level when they're called upon. And if he's the head of player development, a lot of this money is being spent on player development. So he is going to have his hands really dirty in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that role sort of elevates in the years to come. There's still more staffing, I think, that's going to be added in addition to what we talked about yesterday, where they're sort of branching off and thinking about, okay, Randy Flores has his role in the way that you're scouting for the amateur draft and you're trying to identify the best players possible and get those guys into the organization. And then there's the layer of hey, the pro scouting, how do we identify and evaluate players in other organizations, additional resources. We've kind of used that. It almost has become similar to the runway term, where all year we talked about, oh, guys are going to have runway. And then you kind of say that word enough times where you go, what does that actually even mean? And is it being accomplished in the way the Cardinals set out to accomplish it? I think the term resources is sort of one that's being thrown around because you can think of that in several different ways. In the final waning years of the Mozeliak era, they used resources heavily, maybe not as heavily as some Cardinals fans wanted, but oftentimes it was toward the major league roster and the payroll, right? We've got a need in the rotation. Let's go buy a pitcher. Let's go buy Lance Lynn. Let's go add Kyle Gibson. Hey, Sonny Gray can be a staple for a few years on a multi-year contract. That's how they devoted a lot of the resources, trying to basically plug the holes in the bottom of the boat to make sure it didn't sink. And then they just kind of kept pushing that boulder up the hill, as I just use a bunch of different analogies. And they kind of eventually realized, Joe, like, we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting back to the heyday when we were constantly developing those complementary players. We were able to identify, whether it was via trade, via free agency, the key cogs in the middle of the order that were going to be the star players. And, you kind of did that with Goldschmidt and Arenado. Those guys were beginning to wane. The complementary pieces were not quite as productive, not quite as major league ready by the time they got to the big leagues. And they realized continuing to plug the hole by spending in free agency wasn't the best way to go about it. And so you kind of did have to start from square one and from ground zero. You're going to bring in Chaim Bloom and say, we recognize that we haven't necessarily had the infrastructure in place and we weren't devoting the resources, there's that word again, to some of the things that happened behind the scenes. And the first thing he did is, okay, I'm bringing in Rob Cerfolio to be part of this process, and we're going to continue to branch out from there. What are the areas that we need to identify that we need to beef up behind the scenes so that we have talent in place that can make the most of what the major league roster can look like down the line? That's such an interesting thing to think about, and it's one that, again, it might be a little bit weird for Cardinals fans because how much can we know that these moves that are being made behind the scenes and the infrastructure and the resources that are being devoted to the things that we don't see between the white lines necessarily right away, how can we know that these things are moving the organization forward? I think that's where a little bit of that patience comes in to allow it to develop over multiple years. But that's why it's interesting to talk about folks like Rob Cerfolio, who I think, if you hear from anybody in the Cardinals organization, has only really, really good things to say about, his intellect and he's savvy. He gets it. He's able to relate to players. He's a 32, 33-year-old guy himself. And so I think there's this relation that he's able to have with players where he gets buy-in to say, hey, I've got a lot of a background in some of these data analytics and different things that I can bring to the table. But really finding ways to relate to the younger player, the older player, and bring those guys in on the vision that the Cardinals are looking to implement over the next 2 to 3 years, I think is a huge key in how they're going to be able to turn this thing around. I think he is such a central figure in it.
More on Cerfolio in just a second, but want to remind you that coming up December 1st, that is when new Missouri customers can get in on the action with DraftKings Sportsbook, America's top-rated sportsbook, and you can get $300 in bonus bets when they launch on December 1st. Download now and place a $5 bet when they go live. DraftKings Sportsbook brings you everything you need to elevate your game day experience, including live in-game betting, lightning-fast payouts, and endless ways to get in on the action right from your phone. Download DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use code STL Sports and grab $300 in bonus bets with just a $5 bet when they go live on December 1st. That's code STL Sports in partnership with DraftKings Sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. 21 plus, physically present in Missouri. Eligibility restrictions apply. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. Excludes customers who redeem pre-launch sign-up offer. Terms at sportsbook.draftkings.com/promos. We mentioned it earlier in the show. You mentioned the name of Michael Gersh, and that's one person that I imagine that Cerfolio is going to be compared to, or at least thought about when you look at his role with the team. And as you mentioned, it is two very different roles that are there. Gersh was brought on, and he was originally the assistant GM, and then promoted up to the general manager position when Mo took on the president of baseball operations title for that. And this isn't the same. Cerfolio is starting as the assistant GM, but does have other roles, other jobs in place, from what it seems, than what Gersh did have.
Well, and I would say the phrase to kind of update is not he's not the assistant GM, he's an assistant GM, because it's really organizational structure that we're talking about here. When you check the Cardinals directory, and look, this could change, but like you think about, there are other assistant general managers like Randy Flores. One of his titles is assistant GM. That's true of Rob Cerfolio. It's also true of Moises Rodriguez. But then you look at, okay, what are some of the other areas in which they're focused as an assistant GM? Well, for Randy Flores, he's the director of scouting. And again, that's a department that I don't think his role necessarily changes. There is the potential, I suppose, for Randy Flores to end up in another organization if he's hired to one of the high-ranking front office positions in baseball that are open in other places at this point. That's something to maybe look out for. I don't know the degree to which that will or won't happen, but Chaim Bloom has said, hoping to retain a lot of their senior level front office executives at this point in time. But Moises Rodriguez, he's kind of in the international scouting department. Major League Operations is another part of his title. For Cerfolio, it is that player development and performance. And so I don't know. I'd have to look back when he was assistant GM. What was Mike Gersh's kind of department? I off the top of my head do not recall. He's a big kind of data analytics guy, though. I think people kind of give Mike Gersh a bit of a bad rap. It's like, oh, what does he even do? He was very involved in a lot of that data type of stuff that you would want to have, I think, as an organization. And look, the Cardinals are now with Bloom and Surf, I think, going to be very focused in that area as well. But just kind of updating and making sure you're up to speed on all of the elements of that, or even becoming an industry leader again. That's sort of what Chaim Bloom, I think, mentioned in his intro press conference was, this is an organization that when you look at some of the advances that were made in baseball, like they were kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of it, and they want to get back to being in that position. I don't think anybody right now would argue that the last few years of the Cardinals organization looked that way. But what I think is interesting, ultimately, when Gersh was elevated to GM, I think a lot of people thought that was going to mean, he's taking on a bigger role. He's having a much bigger voice in some of the organizational decisions that happen. And I think that didn't ultimately materialize, in my opinion, to the level that I believe it was intended. I do believe that there were reasons for that. Like when you think about the way that COVID impacted things, I think that was around the timeline that really Mo was looking to go, okay, I can push some of the responsibilities onto somebody else's plate, and I can begin to maybe not necessarily phase out, but I could kind of look at the light at the end of the tunnel and say, like, some responsibilities year by year are going to be divvied up differently to where, you can have that kind of seamless transition at whatever point Mo would have exited the organization. COVID happened, and it was like, he's got to be the voice front and center. Mo felt that in an era like that where things were happening, the Cardinals were kind of in the middle of all of that mess in 2020. I think 2020, if there was no COVID, would have been a year that you would have seen Mike Gersh elevate and start to do more of that day-to-day with the media. And I think that kind of coincided with Mo feeling like he had to grab the reins and be like the one consistent voice for the organization. And so that transition never really happened in the way that we thought it would. And then on the field, of course, after 2022, you start to take a dip. And so it kind of was, I don't think ever the last 5 years of Cardinals baseball went as Mo intended, but I do believe that COVID was a big reason for that. But now we transition to, okay, what does it look like for Cerfolio? And you compare him to a Mike Gersh. I guess the question ultimately becomes, if he's the number two in the way that we view the Cardinals front office behind Chaim Bloom right now, I'd be very curious to see if ultimately he does elevate to the GM title in the same way, but has to maybe sort of have his hands right now on the player development and performance aspects more so, because that's the stage of the rebuild the Cardinals are in. Or does it become a case where they hire somebody else eventually to be that GM? For me, I think with the way that Rob Cerfolio serves a big purpose in the organization, they'll want his role to grow and be elevated in such a way that keeps him here for the long haul, right? Because you think about all the different names that were underneath Mozeliak that moved on, Jeff Luhnow and Mike Elias and all these different figures that ended up kind of spreading their wings in we talk about the coaching tree in football. The GM and executive tree underneath John Mozeliak ended up being very fruitful and going to other places and heading up those organizations. I think they'll want to keep Rob Cerfolio as integrated in this thing for as long as they possibly can. So down the line, if he were to be the one named GM, a la Mike Gersh, I don't think that would be particularly surprising. But right now, development, performance, he's very focused in those areas, which think a lot of Cardinals fans would agree that's what the organization needs as they embark upon a rebuild.
Yeah, and to Matt's point here, saying, for anybody that has seen interviews or heard interviews with him, seem to be, they said, present him as a very sharp guy. I mean, he's a Yale grad, so yeah, he is he is a pretty sharp guy, and doing this and taking on this role at the age of 33 is something you don't see all that often. So he is he is definitely far ahead in intelligence and where others are. It is his current role.
If this works, if the Chaim Bloom era of the St. Louis Cardinals works, and they get this infrastructure in place, and they become an organization that's again churning out quality big league talent, and they're doing it through the draft and develop plan, and it's all under the Chaim Bloom organizational tree. Rob Cerfolio eventually goes somewhere else to head up a baseball operations department, and he's the guy, right? I think he's got that type of future. I think Chaim Bloom thinks he's got that type of future as well. That's why you make a point to pluck him from the Cleveland Guardians organization, an organization that they're not doing it by going out and spending big and landing marquee free agents. How are the Guardians doing it? They're making the playoffs with frequency by drafting, developing, and getting the most out of their talent. And they've got, I think, an organizational infrastructure in place that is better than what the Cardinals had up until recently. And the goal would be to get that up to speed. So yeah, when they said, look, this you use the whiz kid moniker, right? Because he's 32, 33 years old when you hire him. That's the guy that Chaim Bloom clearly targeted, had tried to hire him away when Bloom was in Boston and didn't end up making that happen. But here, I think Bloom had the authority to say, like, I'm building my team. He's the first guy that I'm going to bring in, and I'm making it a point to do so. I think that's very meaningful. And I think as the years go on, Cardinals fans will view Rob Cerfolio in kind of this might be like heavy praise, because some Cardinals fans go way too far with the way they praise this individual. But like a Jeff Lunau, in terms of the way that Cardinals fans will pine for the era and say, oh, Lunau, they'll give him like outsized credit almost compared to, Mozeliak in some of the moves and things that happened. They'll say that's the one that got away because he went to Houston and ended up doing great things before, things went off the rails. I think in terms of influence, like, don't mistake what I'm saying. I think Rob Cerfolio can have a significant influence on this era of Cardinals baseball and the way that they're going to reimagine this front office under Chaim Bloom.
I'm sure we will hear more from him and more about him in the months to come, leading up to the start of spring training, and then go from there with everything else that we know about his role and all of the roles of the new front office names that we will all be hearing about over the next several months with the St. Louis Cardinals. Until then, he is Brenden Schaeffer. I'm Joe Roderick. This has been another edition of Cards Central 365 here on STL Sports Central. All content brought to you by DraftKings. The crown is yours.